all names. We're in Genesis chapter 14 this week, beginning chapter 14. Verse 1 and 2 reads like this. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedor Laomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemember, king of Zeborim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. So we get into some different details here in our account concerning the journey and the history of Abraham. Now, just who this Amraphel was, we're not for sure what we can find in our studies, but he evidently was a king that carried quite a bit of weight with others that were called kings in that day, and he was able to rally them, joining them together in a rebellion against those who had held them in servitude for so long. They wanted deliverance. Mr. Clark, in his comments, says, it appears from Genesis 14 and 4 that these 5 Canaanitish kings had been subdued by Kedor Laomer and were obliged to pay him.
The problem is, what's supposed to remain on record should be the other side.
And that having been enslaved by him 12 years, wishing to recover their liberty, they revolted in the 13th, in consequence of which Kedor Laomer, the following year, summoned to his assistance 3 of his vassals, invaded Canaan, and fought with and discomfited the kings of the Pentapolis, are 5 cities of Sodom, and they're all mentioned here. But anyway, verse 3 says, all these were joined together in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. The lower valley area in which these cities were located was evidently, from what we can glean, a very prosperous as well as beautiful valley. And when sin and ungodliness, when that comes into the picture, which in turn brought the judgment of God upon that region, then they were destroyed and were inundated by the Salt Sea. We'll read that later when we get to the story of Lot and Abraham's intervention for his nephew, because judgment would come upon Sodom and Gomorrah at a later time. In verse 4, it says, 12 years they served Kedor Laomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. Well, 12 years, I guess we can say should be long enough, or should we say too long, to be held in servitude or in bondage. And so there is a rebellion that is created because of this servitude that they had endured or suffered under. Verse 5, it says, in the 14th year came Kedor Laomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shava Kiriathim. And then in verse 6, the Horites in their Mount Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. So all of these people, kings and groups, are getting together to fight and find if they can overcome their enemy. And we can imagine that the troubles that evolved in this period of time, everybody, I say everybody, in every area, there's somebody that wants to stand up and say, I'm boss, I'm king. There were people great in many in the days of Moses, such as the Anakims that we can read about as well. The Moabites, by whom they were reputed giants, a people that dwelt in Mount Seir till Esau and his sons drove them out. In verse 17, we continue our journey here in the record. They returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, smote all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites, which dwelt in Hazez-on Tamar. Archaeologist Nelson Gluck documents the destruction when he writes, I found that every village in their path had been plundered and left in ruins, and the countryside was laid waste. The population had been wiped out or led away into captivity. For hundreds of years thereafter, the entire area was like an abandoned cemetery, hideously unkempt, with all of its monuments shattered and strewn in the pieces on the ground. And then another interesting comment from another commentator, Mr. Guzik. He wrote, now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits. The Hebrew here is a good example of how the language uses repetition to show emphasis. The Hebrew way of saying full of pits is pits of bitumen. Repetition expresses abundance, plenitude. Now, in verse 8, the battle begins. There went out the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with verse 9, with Kedor Laomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. 4 kings against 5 kings that are battling for superiority. Who's going to rise above the chaos and declare as being king? When somebody demands full power and control over the life of and finances of others, there's got to be trouble. We look at the nations that have had a dictator that held their people in bondage and see how it worked out in the long run. We've experienced that through the years in our history. And there are countries right now that are in control of dictators or communist leaders, and that are destroying their country, and different ones we could name. And it just doesn't make sense why there are those countries that are influenced and controlled, and they destroy their country, destroy their people. But that's happened time and again, and this is a good example of it to some degree, at least, in our story here in this chapter. In verse 10, it says, the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. Now, the Hebrew here, we are told, is a good example of how the language uses repetition, as we mentioned previously, about to show emphasis. And this is a good example here, we are told, concerning to emphasize in the original writings, how it's put together. Now, in verse 11, they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals, and went their way. Now, notice they took all the goods of Sodom, which is further proof that Kedor Laomer and the rest of his confederates in this war were petty princes, I guess we could say, like the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sometimes people want titles, and this is a good example, I think, that we're studying about in these characters. And everybody wants to be king. And having broken the armies of the 5 kings, they rested contented and marched away with the prisoners and the booty, but took not one of their cities, which they had been. If they had been such great kings as they claimed, surely they would have sacked, destroyed, maybe even burnt the city if they had not thought fit to keep the city and reign over them. But they just take many kidnapped many. There was a predatory war, let's call it, such as the Arabs carry out on today in our history. They pillage a city, a town, or a caravan, and then they run away with the booty to the wilderness, where it would be unsafe, if not impossible, to pursue them, because they know the hideouts. They took Lot. Verse 12 tells us, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Now, we've looked at in our previous studies about the decision that Lot made concerning going to this place called Sodom. And this is one of the good examples of the consequence of his unwise decision. And perils, troubles, problems arising from our worldly choices and joining with ungodly companions, this is a good example here for us. Young people often suffer through the companions they join in their life. Lot lost the property for the increase of which he was so anxious. He trusted more to the strong walls and untried friends in Sodom than he trusted in God. And Lot begins to reap what he's sown, and because of this lust after material things. After all, he's one of the judges that sat in the gate. He felt important, but he's overwhelmed and he's captured by this enemy. In verse 13, there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. Now, this is the first use of the word Hebrew. This is the first place you'll find the word Hebrew in our Bible. And Barnhouse lets us know that the word Hebrew comes from a root that means passed over. The Septuagint translates it the passenger, and that's what Abraham. This is a description of Abraham. He passed over, and he wasn't certainly a passenger on his way to Canaan. Obviously, this escapee, whoever he was, knows that Abram is a relative of Lot somehow. Otherwise, why would he run to Abram asking for help? This part we're left wondering and don't know for sure. But somebody escaped from the battle and made his way to Abram. Verse 14 and 15 says, when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. Now, this as well is quite interesting. First, it says that these that were fighting and going to conquer the enemy that had kidnapped these people were trained servants. Makes us wonder why. But living in that time, in that condition, I would imagine there was a lot of problems, a lot of enemies, a lot of bandits or whatever. But Abram had taken time to train some servants, 318 of them. And he divided himself against them. Verse 15 said, he and his servants by night, and smote them. So we see the great wealth of Abram. Any man that can assemble 318 servants capable of fighting a battle with an enemy, well, I would think he would be a pretty rich man. Abram was a man that walked in faith, and yet he was also a prudent man. Abram kept his own personal army, and he apparently kept them trained and ready to defend his interests. So here's a tremendous lesson for us here in preparation, in taking care of our own selves as well, that although we have faith in God, that doesn't mean we should not prepare physically or socially. Abram's army pursued the confederacy of these 5 kings for a long distance to the north. As to how far it was, I don't really know. But the city of Dan, we read later, lets us know it was all the way up the northern border of Israel. So it was quite a distance. In verse 16, he brought back all the goods and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Now, obviously, what we read here, we maybe pass over it sometimes in our reading of the scriptures, but Abraham was a smart man, not only a rich man, but a smart man. He had military wisdom. He knew to use the clever tactics of fighting these battles. Night attack with his army split into 2 different groups. And he also succeeds in rescuing Lot, recovering all the booty, everything that was taken, stolen, if you will, seized by the confederacy of these 5 kings. Now, what we don't have, of course, there's so much that's we got to read between the lines, as it were. We don't know just exactly how the attack took place, how they prepared, but evidently they knew what to do. And unfortunately, Lot is going to move right back to where he was in Sodom. That's interesting. He had pitched his tent toward Sodom, eventually moved into Sodom, became quietly involved, not quietly, that's not the right word. He became involved in the affairs of Sodom, even to the point to where he was one of the judges that sat at the gate. And so Sodom, and he thought Sodom was a good place to live, I guess, and raise those daughters. But he was looking from a carnal standpoint instead of spiritual, which is always dangerous. He refuses this warning from God, and he'll eventually lose everything when Sodom and Gomorrah are judged, that we read about in a later chapter. So then we come to something unique and quite interesting, and that is verse 17, the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Kedor Laomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh. which is the king's dale, the king of Sodom. Well, I have a question here with the reference of the king of Sodom. How can this be the king of Sodom? For we read in verse 10 that he, along with the king of Gomorrah, had fallen in the slime pits. Don't know, but one commentator by the name of Clark, Adam Clark, long ago, many years ago, a commentator, he said this could not have been Bera, mentioned in Genesis 14:2, for it seems pretty evident from Genesis 14:10 that both he and Bersha, king of Gomorrah, were slain at the bitumen pits in the Vale of Siddim. But another person in the meantime might have succeeded to the government. We don't know, but that's Adam Clark's comment. So this is another thing that we don't have the clear understanding of just what took place. So to have him call here the king of Sodom, and again in those days, I would suppose, I have no scripture, but I'm suppose, knowing a little bit about humanity, I could suppose that as soon as one man fell from power, there was always somebody standing in the shadows waiting to take his place. Maybe that was what the case was here. But anyway, in verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Now here we're introduced to a very interesting, particularly important character, a person who has raised a lot of interest among Bible students throughout the years, and that is just who was Melchizedek? We have so many different opinions about that. Let me share one, and that's John Gill, noted commentator. He writes, both the Targums of Jonathan and Jerusalem say this is Shem, the son of Noah, and which is the sense of the Jewish writers in general, and many Christian ones. But though it is highly probable he was living at this time, yet it is not easy to account for it, why his name should be changed, or that he should reign in a country in the possession of his brother's son, or that he should meet Abram and congratulate him on the slaughter of one of his own descendants, as Kedar Laomer was. And especially it cannot be said of him that he was without father or mother, or that those were not known, since Shem's parentage and pedigree are famous enough. Some have thought him to be more than a mere man, even the Son of God himself, but he is manifestly distinguished from him in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3. He seems to be what Josephus says he was, a Canaanitish prince, a pious and religious man, eminently raised up by God, and whose genealogy was kept a secret, that he might be in this, as in other things, a type of Christ. That's a long comment, but I thought it was interesting to share it with you from John Gill. Borrowing again from David Guzik, he says, we have no idea of where Melchizedek came from, how he came to be in Canaan, how he came to be a worshiper and priest of God, and how Abram came to know him. We only know he was there. Melchizedek becomes a very interesting man. He served Abram bread and wine. Perhaps he even served them in a manner looking forward to our redeeming sacrifice. As the bread and wine of Passover and the Lord's table look at our redeeming sacrifice, Jesus Christ. He was the priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek, as priest, did two things. He blessed Abram and he blessed God. Melchizedek shows a priest must connect with both God and man and has a ministry to both God and man. The words of David Guzik. Now, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. He is the king of Salem. Now, Salem is the original Jerusalem, and Melchizedek is the priest of God Most High. He is a worshiper. He's a priest of the true God. He's ruling over Jerusalem, even in those ancient times. One thing making Melchizedek unique is that he's both a king and a priest. And history shows us how dangerous it is to combine religious and civic authority. In fact, when God gives the law to Moses, he differentiates between the kings and the priests. A king could not be a priest, and a priest could not be a king. And King Uzziah tried to do the work of a priest. We find that, like in Second Chronicles, God struck him with leprosy. Well, in verse 19, we go on, and he blessed him. It said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth." So Melchizedek, though he seems like an obscure figure that is just appears right here with no real introduction, he figures to be a very important Old Testament character. In fact, the psalmist will speak of him in chapter 110 of Psalms, in verse 4. He says the priesthood of Messiah, Jesus Christ, is a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, as opposed and different, of course, from the order of Aaron or the kings. Now, as we mentioned, one writer supposed, there mentioned that some suppose that this was Seth. But again, we don't accept that kind of opinion. I borrow comments from Hebrews 7:1 that I wrote in my commentary, Hebrews commentary, and I state there, we know that during the Old Testament economy, the altar and the throne were kept separate from one another. The one on the throne was not allowed to officiate at the altar. And we see where Saul got into trouble with God when he intruded into this office, 1 Samuel 13, verses 8 through 14. But the writer informs us that Melchizedek was both king and priest. We know that Jesus Christ also fills the office of king and priest. The writer informs us that Jesus Christ was our great high priest, and that it is passed into the heavens. I'm still quoting from my commentary. We also know that when he returns, as described as far as by John in Revelation 19:12, he will be wearing many crowns. For John states in verse 16, he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, while Israel never had a king who was also their high priest, there was someone who preceded the time of the giving of the law, who did serve in both offices. And there is one who has succeeded the law, who as well fills both offices. This is what the writer is emphasizing in his argument in this chapter. Jesus, like Melchizedek, is both king and priest. That's my quote from my commentary on Hebrews. But anyway, what a interesting character. We'll have to stop today because of our time, but we'll get into it a little more, the Lord willing, later. But it's a very interesting man, Melchizedek as well as Abram. They're both very interesting and captivating in our studies. God bless. God bless the work in Kenya, throughout Kenya and elsewhere. Bless Brother Michael. God bless and watch over you, and bless your family and the church at Dewa. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
God bless you, Sister Jacqueline.